much, Professor Magwa. Thank you for agreeing to this interview. In your quality of co-chair of the Global Task Force of the UNESCO International Decade of Indigenous Languages, 2022-2032, you recently participated as a panelist to a G20 side event of the Culture Working Group, which was held in Durban, South Africa. One of the objectives of the side event was to advance indigenous languages as vital to African unity, heritage preservation, and grassroots development. You were invited to talk about the role of languages in technologies. But before leading to this topic, could you share with us the different steps that led us to the International Decade of Indigenous Languages?
It's true. The United Nations declared the International Decade of Indigenous Languages, that is from 2022 to 2032. It's a decade set aside specifically for the protection and promotion of indigenous languages. Across the world, many languages are endangered, or I can say they've already disappeared. And this disappearance of indigenous languages in many countries prompted international actors to seek a coordinated action plan to seek long-term commitments to language preservation, commitments to language revitalization, and also commitments to the transmission of these languages to younger generations. On 18 December 2019, if I'm not mistaken, the United Nations General Assembly made a resolution, popularly known as Resolution 74/135. And this resolution is on the rights of indigenous people, who proclaimed that this decade should be set aside for the development of indigenous languages. United Nations, once they did that, they invited UNESCO to serve as the lead agency for this international decade. And the UNESCO, as I always say, also created the Global Task Force to implement the resolutions of the international decade, or the resolutions of the United Nations with regards this international decade.
Thank you very much, Professor Magwa, for this explanation. And as the co-chair of the task force of the decade, what are the key principles that guide your work and the work of the task force?
The Global Task Force was created to provide advice and guidance on the preparation, planning, implementation, and even monitoring progress towards the attainment of the objectives of the Global Action Plan. Because the decade has got specific action plans with goals and targets and objectives which should be met. So the task force was created to make sure that all these targets. The key principles are 4: equality, diversity, inclusion, and participation. These are the pillars that guide our operations as a global task force, and the pillars that also guide me as co-chair of the task force.
Thank you, Professor Magwa. My next question is, how can member states take a leading role in the implementation of the decade?
Let me be blunt and simply say, member states, they must demonstrate political will to elevate and integrate the IDL into national policies. I think that's the best that they can do for the international decade. Political will to elevate and integrate IDL into all national policies. They must pass what I would call a high-level policy declaration, or they must make high-level cabinet decisions to affirm commitment government commitments to indigenous language rights and IDIL objectives. This is very critical. The decisions must be made at the cabinet level of the member states. The member states or the government of member states should integrate IDIL into national development plans, into education plans, into cultural plans or cultural heritage strategies. So there is that need for integrating. So the languages should be an overarching issue during this decade in all governance or programs, in all government programs. There is also need for member states to align with international human rights obligations. You know, we've got United Nations declarations, particularly the United Nations Declaration on the rights of indigenous peoples and other regional and global declarations. So the different governments of the member states should make sure that they align themselves to these international human rights obligations. And finally, I am saying, as a co-chair of the Global Task Force, there is need for each member state to appoint a national coordinator or to create a national team, national committee to see the full implementation of the Global Action Plan or the localization of the Global Action Plan in the different member states. So there must be ministerial task force with clear terms of reference, with clear timelines and accountability in as far as language issues are concerned. So at the global, every meeting of the GTF, the Global Task Force, we are now making a point that there is also an agenda item that deals with an update on the development of national action plans. Only a few countries so far have done it. I think they are just about 15 that have from 2020 to 2025, about 15 member states have already developed national action plans, which they are now implementing. The rest of the member states, out of the 194 member states, they are still at different stages of the development of the national action plans. So that's what we want all member states to be doing. And I am sure it's doable. It's doable. So each member state on this planet, on this globe, should take a leading role in the implementation of the decade. No state should be left behind.
There's a lot of activities and actions that could be taken indeed. My next question is, what role should regional bodies as the African Union, the SADC or ECOWAS play in promoting, preserving and protecting indigenous languages, specifically in a digital context?
These organizations, they should provide policy leadership. Bodies like the African Union, the SADC and ECOWAS, to mention but a few, they must set regional standards. They must provide regional guidelines. And even the Global Action Plan, before we get to national action plans, before we even go down to institutional action plans, there must be a regional framework. Regional frameworks that must be organized by bodies like the African Union or SADC. We must have SADC frameworks during the Global Action Plan. There must be an African Union framework because we must draw from the Global Action Plan and come down to the regions. So I am saying we want now these regional standards. We want these regional guidelines to provide, for example, the digital language rights. How do we govern our data? What are the ethical considerations? There must be these regional guidelines provided for each member state. And I'm saying we member states should adopt some kind of regional charters. The regions must provide regional charters or regional protocols. But these charters and protocols must always recognize multilingualism. We cannot run away from it. We are a multilingual continent, and even our nations, they are also multilingual in nature. So with regards to digitization of our languages, we must provide within the region multilingual digital ecosystems. So the days of monolingualism are over, to say the least, AJ. Africa is a multilingual nation or continent, and this must be reflected in the regional protocols that we are going to create. So the regional bodies must also make an effort to align themselves, to align their protocols with the global norms. By global norms, I'm referring to the guidelines provided by UNESCO, guidelines provided by United Nations, particularly on indigenous languages. So all education platforms that we might have at the regional levels must be aligned with the guidelines provided in the Global Action Plan during the International Decade of Indigenous Languages. The regional bodies must also coordinate funding and capacity building. I'm thinking here in terms of training. We want to capacitate all member states, because if the mantra is no one should be left behind, then there must be capacity building. The member states should provide for training, and this can be organized at the regional level, at the SADC level, or at the African Union level. So there is a lot that member states should be doing or could be doing to make sure that we implement the targets, we achieve targets spelled out by in the Global Action Plan. So we are saying there is need to build regional capacity. There's need, for example, to build centers of excellence for language technology development, for language teaching, for language development, for language research. So these research or centers for excellence must be operated by indigenous leaders, or there must be a regional coordination of capacity development. So we want to facilitate knowledge sharing across all member states within the region. We want to share the best practices. We want to share the best methodologies. And then with regards the digital context, we are saying we want to establish what I would refer to as a regional digital language fund to promote the indigenous languages within the region. So there is need for coordination, cooperation at the regional level.
Thank you, Professor Magwa. My last question is, what are the next steps? How can we protect, promote, and preserve the indigenous languages?
The first thing that I think we should do as a region, as nations, is to issue what I would refer to as regional declarations on indigenous language rights, particularly in the digital spaces. We have had regional declarations on action plans, the language plan for Africa. We have had those declarations, but we now want a regional declaration specifically on the rights of indigenous people in indigenous spaces. That is still yet to come, and we need it as of yesterday. So we also need to create, in my view, regional policies or a regional policy. It could be just one major policy, regional policies, or we can have what is, instead of really spelling out or trying to be very prescriptive at the regional level, we can have a regional template for member states to integrate indigenous languages. So a template or a framework is flexible enough, because member states, we know they are sovereign states. So sometimes we don't want to prescribe to destroy the sovereignty of certain member states, but we can provide these templates or frameworks for digital infrastructure, for education, language policy in education, for example. And then you come up with these frameworks. Then these regional frameworks will be localized to become national frameworks or national policies. So to me, these are practical solutions to protect and promote our indigenous languages. So there must also be funding for digital language initiatives within the region or even within member states. There must be funding. All member states, I would encourage them to create funding mechanisms for language projects, for human language technologies development, digital infrastructure development. There must be specific budget items for these things to happen. So we must also create, I remember I made reference on to centers of excellence, language hubs. We have technology hubs in almost every university. The STEM hubs where we talk of industrialization, science development. Why not also create language hubs as centers of excellence within the nations? So we want to develop language technology development and training within each member states. Language research, again, should be conducted in all our countries. And the research can be coordinated at the national level. It can also be coordinated even at the regional level. So we must be able to facilitate knowledge sharing across member states. I think that's what I think is best. It's the best practice. Let's just share. The days of having knowledge silos, the silo mentality, I think we should really forget about this. We want to be people who belong to a region, people who belong to a globe, people who can share ideas and move forward as a team. So let's collaborate. I think that's the word that is most appropriate here. Let's collaborate to promote multilingual digital ecosystems. So thank you very much for the interview. I hope I've shared enough information which can also be used to influence the promotion and protection of indigenous languages, not only in Africa, but even beyond the continent, in other continents, so that these ideas can be shared at the global level.
Thank you very much, Professor Magwa, for participating to this interview, and hope to see you very soon. Bye.